All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to join us this evening for our next installment of the Tell Me More Talks with Conservation Minnesota online event series. We're excited that you're all here with us, and we look forward to chatting with our panel tonight about how pollution impacts communities differently and how we can achieve a clean air future. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Tiffany Orth. I'm currently the board president-elect for Conservation Minnesota. And I just wanted to share that I was really motivated to serve on the Conservation Minnesota board because they have worked really hard to forge relationships with people and organizations with varying political views to protect our environment. And in this day and age, it's exactly what we need to make the difference. So I am very proud to be here. And if you're not familiar with Conservation Minnesota, just a little bit about us. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect the Minnesota you love by solving some of our state's most important environmental problems. And we're committed to protecting people and places from the adverse impacts of pollution and climate change while ensuring that everyone who calls Minnesota home has access to the great outdoors and opportunities to enjoy it. Our work is centered around bringing people together across regions, backgrounds, and beliefs to find real solutions. And tonight's Tell Me More topic, particularly resonates with me because in my day job at Move Minneapolis, our mission is to improve air quality actually by reducing congestion and advancing sustainable transportation solutions for downtown Minneapolis. So this one is close to home. And tonight we've assembled an awesome panel that will be talking about something called cumulative impacts and how pollution affects communities differently. We'll talk about air pollution, which communities are most at risk from air pollution, and explore a future where everyone in Minnesota has clean air to breathe. Before we move into our panel discussion, I'd first like to take a moment to introduce our moderator for this evening, James Lehner. He's a policy associate at Conservation Minnesota, where he helps the organization advance our goals at the legislature. During the legislative session, James assists in tracking all the action, monitoring hearings and floor sessions, keeping up with new bills, meeting with legislators, and offering testimony to committees. When the legislature isn't meeting, he helps develop future policy goals, connecting with partners and legislators to investigate shared concerns and brainstorm solutions. And while he's still a relatively new Minnesotan with much yet to explore, currently his favorite outdoor places in the state are Lake Winona and Sugarloaf Bluff. Good ones. James, I'll kick it over to you and let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany. And before we totally pivot away from you, I want to ask in return, where's your favorite outdoor spot in Minnesota?
It's actually kind of evolving, and this is going to sound a little bit cliche, but I just spent a weekend up in the North Shore, and it was exactly what I needed in the moment, an escape but still connected to the city, and it just made me feel like all the problems of the world aren't about. So that's what it is at the moment, but it changes a lot.
Very nice. It totally makes sense. I feel like, again, as a new Minnesotan, I go new places and they all skyrocket up the list. It's hard to pick. But hello, everyone. We're really excited to get into this program tonight. Please don't forget, as you've maybe seen in the chat, drop any questions you might have for the panel in the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All panelists will be able to see your question, and we'll get to them if there's still time at the end of our program. But now I'm excited to introduce you to our panel, as we have a really great group here with us tonight to talk about all things cumulative impacts. First, I'd like to introduce Representative Esther Agbaje, who represents District 59B in Minneapolis, which includes the neighborhoods of Near North, Harrison, Willard Hay, North Loop, and Downtown. Esther was first elected in 2020 and is serving her third term. She's the co-vice chair of the Ways and Means Committee and serves on both the Agriculture and Housing, Finance, and Policy Committees. She's a champion of both environmental and justice issues and was a key supporter of the cumulative impacts rulemaking law. Representative, welcome. And I'll ask you as well, what's your favorite outdoor place in Minnesota?
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I think, like Tiffany, it changes all the time, but right now I'm thinking of basically any lakeshore, being near water and the sand or the ground in your feet. It really is just really calming and really reflective and just really nice. And I like that we have a lot of lakes in the city, so you can always have your pick.
Very nice. Thank you. We also have with us tonight Hassan Bouchareb, who is an engineer with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Air Policy Unit and has worked at the MPCA since 2011. Hassan's work is focused on the cumulative impacts analysis rulemaking and mercury reduction efforts, among other air program efforts. Hassan is a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the U of M Twin Cities. And Hassan, welcome, and I'll ask you as well, what is your favorite outdoor spot in Minnesota?
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, I'd have to go with I also just like spending time outdoors in general, but I think a place I went not too long ago was I went camping with a friend of mine and at Lake Maria State Park. Very fun place to spend a short weekend out there outside and enjoy, especially in the middle of fall with all of the change of leaves.
It's fantastic. And last but not least, joining us tonight, we have Sasha Lewis-Norelle, who is an environmental justice organizer with Copal, Minnesota, a member-based organization working to improve the air quality of life of Latine communities in Minnesota. His work focuses on the intersection of policy and grassroots outreach, working to ensure that environmental justice policy is centered around the needs of historically marginalized and overburdened communities. Through his role at Copal, Sasha helps lead the Frontline Communities Protection Coalition, a group of environmental nonprofits and frontline groups that work to pass Minnesota's cumulative impacts law. Sasha, welcome, and I'll ask you before we move into the rest of the program as well, where's your favorite outdoor place in Minnesota?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I would say despite having lived in Minnesota for a number of years now, I have not explored a lot of the state that I would love to get to. So in terms of local, I would say probably Crosby Farm Park, because I live in St. Paul and it's within walking distance, and it's just nice to be on the river. And like as soon as you walk into the park, like all the other noise disappears, which is just great. And then outside of the Twin Cities, because I grew up in Wisconsin, I have a lot of nostalgia for the Driftless area. And one of my friends used to work at Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center down in southeast Minnesota. So I would sometimes visit her. And that area just is so beautiful with the rolling hills and the streams and all of that. So I'll say that as my other answer.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for sharing. Again, as someone mostly new to Minnesota, my list of places to get to is ever growing. So any and all recommendations I come across, I really do appreciate. Now we can move into the more formal part of our program where we'll be discussing the cumulative impacts work. So I'm going to move straight into our questions, and I'm going to start with you, Hassan. If you could, we're going to lay some groundwork here. Could you just tell me more and tell us more about what cumulative impacts means? A little bit about just the foundation there to frame our conversation, what the problem is, how this works, what you're looking at the agency level, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we have in some cases some definitions from the legislature, but sort of in a bigger picture, kind of when we're thinking about cumulative impacts, um, you could sort of look at this as a big picture understanding of the combined effects of past and current pollution and how that impacts people's health, their well-being, and their quality of life across Minnesota. So we do have here in Minnesota, and one of the things we plan on, talking about today is this program that we are in the middle of creating, this cumulative impacts analysis rule that came about as part of that 2023 legislative session. Due to the lots of advocacy efforts of a few folks on this call and many others across different groups and communities. So generally, what we're trying to work on here is that there are disproportionate exposures to pollution that Minnesotans experience. And specifically, what we're trying to address here in this rule is that exposure with a focus on environmental justice areas around the state, particularly in the 7-county metro, Duluth and Rochester. So these are areas where there's different demographics or different things that people experience where that makes the impacts of pollution a little different depending on who you are or what your experience is, your background, your access to various qualities of life. We know people are impacted by pollution differently on a number of different factors. So an easy one, or maybe that a couple that come to mind are if you think of asthma. My wife, she has asthma, and so anytime we go outside, she has to be a little bit more mindful of what's going on. you might, if you have asthma, be more susceptible to something like fine particulate matter, a type of pollution. You can think of it as like dust. Um, and we know that that pollution impacts everyone's health, but it impacts there's a difference to that impact if you're somebody with asthma, or you're a group of people or a wider group of people that have higher rates of asthma. The same amount of dust in one area impacts a different group of people differently depending on their background and their conditions and what they have. So that's just one example. You can think of a whole bunch of other examples. A common one that other people think about is age. So if you think about children or the elderly, they are also more susceptible to varying impacts of pollution. And so we already do this elsewhere, but we try and keep in mind that, again, we know we're not all the same, and how pollution impacts us all is different depending on a lot of those factors. So this whole thing that we're working on is trying to, to that problem of that disproportionate exposure, we're trying to take a closer look at how can we consider and contextualize these impacts that, if you looked at them all equally, you might miss some things. And so how could we do more of a analysis that looks at it, at those impacts, and thinks about how that affects people's health and the environment that they're in, um, to come up with a program that better, or a way that sort of at least attempts to get at that in a better sense.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hassan, for laying all that out and again, sort of framing that side of this conversation. I want to turn to you now, Sasha. You help to lead the Frontline Communities Protection Coalition, and you're doing really important work there. And I'm hoping you could tell us more about the work you do there, the work you did on all of this to get to this part of the process, to get to the rulemaking, the legislative side of things, any role that you played. How did this start essentially on your end? What has this work looked like on your end? What has your role looked like, and how have we gotten here from your eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always feel like it's important to look back at some of the history when talking about this, because there's so much historical context that's needed to really understand, a lot of this issue and why this is a current issue. And I won't go into a full history lesson because that could take forever, but a very simple aspect of this that has many layers once you look into it, is the issue, the historical issue of redlining, where certain communities were basically segregated through local policy, local zoning policy, and local planning policies that forbade Black people of color from living in certain areas or from creating businesses in certain areas, and so that made a lot of that racial segregation that then also kind of naturally created these sacrifice zones, these areas that planning bodies or government entities or decision makers, historically decided were more, they were more willing to allow pollution in those areas, especially if it would benefit the broader local economy. They were willing to sacrifice the health and well-being of residents in those areas for the sake of broader economic well-being. And so because we had this redlining, it created these very harsh disparities between where industrial pollution and other forms of pollution were being centered around. There are other historical practices. Another good local example in the Twin Cities is the placement of I-94 as a highway, going right through a number of primarily Black and brown communities, despite alternative routes being considered that would have been much less disruptive. And that legacy of pollution and the current issue of pollution there is just another kind of example of how these impacts can really be cumulative. In terms of the policy itself, I also think it's always important to shout out the 2008 law that was passed by former State Representative Karen Clark and others, that specifically targets the South Minneapolis area, specifically kind of the Phillips area, with the goal of having increased analysis of the cumulative impacts of facilities in that area. I would definitely recommend people to look more into the history of pollution in that area. There's been many different polluting facilities there that have led to arsenic and a whole host of other pollutants that have impacted community members there. I also always want to give a shout out to community members for environmental justice and Roxanne O'Brien, a North Minneapolis-based group that is really focused on environmental justice issues. She was the one who originally brought this idea of passing a broader cumulative impacts law to Representative Fu Lee, who was one of the bill authors. She brought this issue to him back in, I believe, 2018. And our coalition, the Frontline Communities Protection Coalition, kind of formed to try and help pass that bill. Our coalition formed, I think, also in 2018 or maybe early 2019 from a partnership primarily between Copal and the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table with, again, some of these other groups as allies. And it took a number of years before we were really able to get more than a foothold. We were able to see some progress with some pretty basic bill language in the state house, but in the Senate, we just never could really get any traction there for the first couple of years. Unfortunately, it was just not something that the Republican-controlled Senate was interested in hearing at that time. I would say things started to really pick up in 2022. We started to have a lot more direct conversations with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency around what would it actually look like to have a comprehensive cumulative impacts law passed. And we had taken a lot of inspiration from New Jersey in particular as the first state to pass a statewide bill or a statewide law around cumulative impacts that is as comprehensive as it is. And so we started having these conversations with the MPCA around what do we want, what do they want, what are our non-negotiables, what are their non-negotiables. And through that process, we got a much better sense of what could be possible, and as well as what we might have to really fight for. And then we really had to kind of pick things up quite a bit after the 2022 election, where we suddenly had a Democratic trifecta going into the 2023 legislative session. And so we worked with Representative Fu Lee, we worked with the MPCA, and went through many iterations of the bill language. And it evolved quite a bit. Initially it was going to include air, water, and land use permits, but then it eventually just focused on air permits. It was also originally going to be a statewide law, but that got narrowed down to the 7-county metro area, Rochester and Duluth. A lot of different changes that might come up later in the conversation as we get more into what the rulemaking actually looks like and that part of the process. But ultimately, we worked to really make sure that there was good representation of our communities at the legislature during this process, especially because 2023 was just an insane year at the legislature. So many things were getting done. It was incredible and also incredibly overwhelming, at least for me as someone who was, that was my first real year being a lobbyist and an advocate at the Capitol. But we really wanted to make sure that community voices who are being impacted by air pollution, by water pollution, by various sorts of pollution, and who also had things like asthma or even some of the non-pollution focused stressors, things like low access to healthcare, like not having good health insurance, that's another part of cumulative impacts, making sure that their voices were being brought to the Capitol and that we were also advocating on their behalf. And ultimately, we were able to get the bill through. And I think Representative Agbaje was going to talk more about the details of actually getting the bill through. But yeah, it was really a combined effort of a ton of different groups coming together and advocating for this, knowing that we need to be doing a better job of understanding the cumulative impacts of pollution in Minnesota, and then also really protecting the communities that have been historically marginalized and historically overburdened by these pollutions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sasha, for your work, first of all, and for sharing all of that detail as well. It really helps to, again, bring us into the whole context, long and short, of where we're at now in this conversation. And since you mentioned some of that legislative process and wanted to get, now we can talk a little more in depth about what that looked like. I'd love to turn to you, Representative Agbaje, to talk about your role in this and your work in this at the legislature. You were pretty involved in this work, as I understand, and you played a very important role in getting this through. And I was hoping you could tell us and tell me and tell this whole group, everyone in our audience, more about what that legislative process looked like for this, what sort of hurdles you were running into, what opportunities presented themselves, and how you were able to navigate these. Again, as Sasha hinted at a time in 2023 and before, when lots of things were moving, lots of things were changing. But what did that process look like for you, and how did that work present itself?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that history, Sasha. I think that was excellent. It covered a lot. I'll just add to that, for us in the legislature, especially in 2023, that was a big opportunity to pass a lot of bills that people had been talking about for years. And it was a time where both the House and Senate were relatively on the same page about how we wanted to move forward. So the environment definitely came up. This cumulative impacts bill was one of, I think, a top priority, if not for the DFL caucus, then definitely for the Posse caucus, which is the People of Color and Indigenous caucus, of which both myself and Representative Fu Lee are a part of. And we made that one of our top priorities in the environmental sector. And so, as we worked that year, a lot of members in that caucus, about 20 of us or so, really made sure that this was top of mind when we talked to our leaders in the caucus and when we talked to other legislators about what we wanted to see passed. And it was great because we were able to bring forward a lot of community members who came to testify, a lot of people who wrote their legislators up and down the state about why this was important to them, about why having clean water, clean air, clean land was beneficial not only just to the affluent and wealthy residents of Minnesota, but to everyone in Minnesota. I think some of the hurdles we faced were really just like understanding how wide and expansive this bill was going to be. So as Sasha talked about it, it started off much bigger, much more comprehensive, really covering the whole state. And I just remember we had a lot of conversations with folks who really wanted to trim it down because in their minds, they thought these pollution issues only happened in the urban areas, which we know that that's not true. And we also know that people of color, Indigenous people live all over the state of Minnesota and have been harmed by pollution and by industry who have taken up basically communities where people of color, where less wealthy people live. That it tends to be where they site these polluting factories, polluting buildings, all of those things. And so what we really had to push back on is this is not just an urban issue. This is not just a Minneapolis, St. Paul issue. This is a whole Minnesota issue. And that was how we were able, ended up being a compromise, but that's why we selected the 7 county metro area, cities of the first class, and then also 1 mile outside of a environmental justice zone, which we defined in the law. And so that at least gets us a big chunk of the state. It doesn't get everywhere, but it does hit places, particularly where people have historically been disenfranchised, where they haven't had a say in what's coming into their community, both in the urban and in the rural areas. And so that was where we really wanted to make sure that we were laying a stake in the ground, that as we were developing policies and laws in 23 and 24, that we definitely had a lens on what justice would look like for residents of Minnesota.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and again for your work and getting that across the finish line and making this possible. Now that we can have this conversation, because there is a bill passed, and we are into this next phase of the process, which is some of the rulemaking. So Hassan, I'll turn back to you. Want to ask you a little bit about where we're at in this process now from your end. Firstly, what are you hearing from Minnesotans about during this process, about this process? What sort of things are coming up as you flesh this out in your role? Where are you currently at in the rulemaking process? And where are the opportunities, or what other opportunities are there for folks to weigh in to talk about this, for you to hear from them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are hearing so much, and part of that is due to some of the great efforts of a couple folks here at the agency. Part of this bill included some funding for extra work surrounding outreach and engagement, and I think that's been extraordinarily helpful to do to be able to do some of the outreach and engagement as part of this rulemaking over the last 2.5 years. We have heard again so much, lots of ideas. Like I could to cover them all would be. I've tried to. It's an hour and a half long conversation of me talking at people basically, and that doesn't do it justice. But we are getting so many ideas on what the program, what these rules should aim to accomplish, what should be looked at in a cumulative impacts analysis, how should decisions be made, how should people be involved. I think there's a lot that um, was really sort of left up to the MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, to come up with and figure out as part of this rulemaking process. You know, the legislature gave us an outline, a pretty good starting point of, you know, here's the major pieces that we want covered. Here's some specifics in a lot of areas, but a lot of the rest of it was um, left up to us to figure out as and doing a lot of outreach and engagement as part of that has been really meaningful, really helpful in doing this. I think some of the larger, like really big picture sort of things that we've been hearing, um, to even from today and back to the start of this rulemaking, was sort of three things in particular: the importance of outreach and engagement and doing more and doing it better, and then transparency, not only during the rulemaking process, but once rules would be in place, you know, transparency and understanding how decisions are made. And then accessibility, again, both, you know, allowing and making it easy for people to participate, or at least easier for people to participate during the rulemaking and during, um, you know, a point in time in the future where these rules are finalized and there is somebody going through this analysis, right? So I think, you know, those are really big picture things, but, you know, again, we're hearing so much from people, as we keep talking about this rule and kind of the things that we're thinking about. So as far as like where we are today, we have a pretty large milestone coming up. These rules, this authorization to do these rules did come with a deadline of we have to get to some draft rules, basically the first look at what this program will aim to accomplish, and the specific language surrounding that in May 2026. So in May is when we'll be publishing the draft rules. This will be where everybody gets to see the actual rule language, the words on paper that will govern how the program works, and that'll include all of the justification, the supporting reasoning behind, you know, how we came up with that particular set of requirements that everybody would follow. So we've been trying to bring people along throughout the rulemaking. We've definitely done a lot in this rule compared to other rules. Not only because the legislature told us to, there's a requirement that we have to do significant outreach and engagement and tribal consultation as part of the rulemaking, but not just because of that, because we know this is a rule, this is a program that people are really interested in for a variety of reasons. So we've been trying to do a lot to bring people along for the ride, and I see we put a couple links here that I was going to talk about in just a little bit in the chat. But before we get there, just to sort of put a pin in this milestone of where we are right now, that 2026 May timeframe, that's going to be the start of the very formal opportunity for people to weigh in and participate further in this rule and what this program looks like. We've been doing a lot of sort of what we have been referring to as informal efforts. So we've talked to folks like Sasha and others who are interested in the outcome of this rule, asked questions about what they think, what would they like to see. Here's some, you know, general ideas of where we're going. We don't have all of the, you know, I's dotted and T's crossed, but we could go this way, we could go that way. Kind of, what do you think? So there's been a lot of, you get to see the process where it's not just we've come out and said, here's what the rules look like and here's all the reasons why. A lot of work over this last 2.5 years has been that very piecemeal, we're bringing you along, we don't have all the answers, which is, as a side note, is I think one of my favorite comments that we had at one of these outreach opportunities. We had a public meeting and there was a gentleman who showed up and he said something along the lines of, I expected you guys to have more here," and very very like candidly, but don't take it for, you know, negatively, but he's like, yeah, you guys really don't know what you're doing just yet. We're like, no, we don't. We're 6 months in, or it was a year in at that point. There was still a lot to figure out. So the one thing I want to highlight here for this May 2026 and that formal opportunity is up until now, up until then, up until May, this has been informal, and we have a lot of opportunities to have conversations, and we've had some deadlines for things like comments. Hey, we're talking about this thing. We're sort of putting a deadline out there to say, give us some information if you can within 30 days. Um, we've been able to be flexible there in, folks said, hey, I need a little extra time, or is it okay if my comments come in a day or a week later? And yeah, that was, and sure, certainly we were able to accommodate that. This very formal opportunity in 2026 is going to be different, in which case MPCA isn't running the comment period. This is something that is part of the administrative rulemaking process. There's going to be a very formal public notice. It'll say, here is the comment period. It's leading up to a public hearing. These are all comments that are not going to be provided to the MPCA. You are instead uh, telling an administrative law judge at the Court of Administrative Hearings, another sort of agency here in Minnesota, that is basically going to be reviewing all of the work that we've done to say, did MPCA follow all of the rules for how they are supposed to conduct a rulemaking? Do we have all of, the reasoning there? Are all of the things that we need to provided, essentially? And so at that point, there is not that sort of flexibility. It's a very legal proceeding that has lots of rules and requirements surrounding it. So just one thing I wanted to note, because it is a sort of a contrast to some of the efforts that we've been doing over the last 2.5 years. And then last but not least, I just wanted to highlight, I am giving you the very quick rundown of some of the engagement work that we've done. We've done a ton of work, especially the team here at MPCA doing that outreach and engagement. If you want to hear more about that, we did announce a couple of open houses in the Twin Cities, Duluth, and Rochester. Those are coming up. We have 2 in November and 1 in December. Duluth is on November 12th. Rochester is November 20th, and then those 2 have both been announced previously in an email, and I think we're just planning today with an email to come soon saying there will be one in the Twin Cities area December 4th. We're still working through the details and confirming all of the stuff needed for the location itself and the timing and all that, but those will be some opportunities if you want to hear about some of the work that the engagement team has been doing and hear a little bit more about sort of details on what folks have told us over these last 2.5 years.
Thanks so much, Hassan. And I believe folks can see in the chat, my colleague Avery dropped a link that includes some more information on those upcoming open houses, which reminds me, folks in the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop this in the chat if you would like, and we will get to them should time allow. But I will move us now back to Sasha. From you, I want to hear your perspective from your coalition work, from the community work you've done. What are you hoping to see come out of this process in the community, in this at this time where voices are able to contribute, where folks are going out and meeting with MPCA and learning and contributing? What are you hoping to see from that perspective? And what do you think is needed to ensure that these communities that are most impacted by pollution are able to enjoy a clean air future?
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that I could take this, but I think a few of the key points from my perspective, and also from what I've been seeing from people and hearing from other people, is Hassan touched on kind of that transparency point, and I think that's like an overall theme within all of this, both around like decision making, but also just like a better understanding of what is in our communities and how are people being impacted. And so for example, like I know as part of the rulemaking, MPCA is creating an EJ tool, like an EJ mapping tool that'll help us get a better visual understanding of like how our different impacts, kind of represented or reflected in different areas, and what are the areas that have like that are highly overburdened or are significantly worse off in certain stressors compared to others. And so I think that'll be really helpful for just community members and advocates and pretty much everyone to get this better understanding of that kind of historical context that I mentioned and the disparities that exist as they are. And then having like a rule that helps to discourage, I guess, additional pollution being added to those overburdened communities. But for me, like I've been really thinking of this law and these rules as a tool that our community should be able to use. So not only just being able to get that better understanding, but also, if a facility is, having a certain level of impact in an already overburdened community, then the law says that that facility either has to not get permitted or they have to enter into a community benefit agreement. And for us, that part has been like the most important part of all of this is making sure that that agreement, which according to the statute is between the MPCA and the facility owner, really does represent what the community itself wants. We want to make sure that the community has opportunities to voice what they want, whether that is, we understand the impacts from the analysis, from the cumulative impacts analysis. We understand, that we are overburdened and that this facility is contributing to that. And we're okay with that as long as we get, these mandated benefits, making sure that, communities can, address their goals through that kind of process. Or alternatively, we want to make sure that, communities can say, we see the analysis, we understand that we're overburdened, we live that, and we actually don't want this facility. We don't want a community benefit agreement. And so we would rather that this facility does not get permitted. Obviously, it's up to the MPCA to decide what that process looks like, and there's a lot to balance there. But from our perspective, we want this process, or we want this law to work as a tool where communities can address air pollution and other forms of pollution, and also, be an opportunity for community benefit agreements to potentially advance things like local jobs or increasing green space, or, from my perspective, it should be a whole host of opportunities for them to meet their goals as a community and to get benefits that make sense for them as a community. So ultimately, we need to address these pollution disparities. And at least from my perspective, like we passed this law to give some of this kind of decision-making power to the communities themselves. Like, I don't want to be telling a community that's not mine what's best for them. I want them to be able to determine that and have the tools that they need to make that happen.
Great. Thank you for that, Sasha. So now thinking of this conversation, we've passed a law, we've gone into the rulemaking process. We kind of now know where we stand. I want to turn now to Representative Agbaje. We've done those steps, passed a bill, we're in rulemaking. What are the next steps you hope to see or might want to see at the legislature that can help build on this work and ensure that these goals of a clean air future for all Minnesotans can still be met? What does the next phase of this in the legislative sense look like in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what I hope is that we can continue to kind of build on this law. I hope we can go back to it and make it more comprehensive, similar to New Jersey, hopefully, or at least just like similar to what people in Minnesota want. And then I think another piece of this too is making sure that we're using this lens of cumulative impacts to think about any other development projects or highway projects or transit projects or just whatever development is coming to Minnesota, that we're thinking about it in the context of how can we make sure that it has a real community benefit and that it's reparative, especially if it's going to go into an area that's already overburdened, or how can we share that burden across the entire state rather than always going to the same communities that have always been targeted. So I think from a legislative perspective, what I'm hopeful to see is that as different environmental bills come up, as different development projects come up, that we think about it from that perspective of how do we make sure we're sharing the burden across everyone in the state, especially if the benefit hopefully is also to be shared with everyone in the state.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And hopefully there's more good work to come in the legislative sense. Hassan, sorry, I hit the wrong button. And I want to turn back to a point Sasha made earlier about work in other states that has informed this. We know that Minnesota is one of only a few states at this point to have passed a cumulative impacts law. And I'm wondering on your end if there's anything you've learned from what other states have done. I believe, Sasha, you mentioned New Jersey is one of those states. Is there anything you've seen or learned from those other states that you've been able to bring into this process, apply to this process, and start thinking about on your end?
Yeah, thanks, James. Absolutely. And I think this was some of the very first things we did, and we continue to do throughout this whole throughout this whole rulemaking. Some of the first ways we talked to and thought to do some outreach and engagement on this rule is bringing in experts from other states who have similar programs. So, Sasha mentioned earlier that a lot of work in crafting the bill was looking at places like New Jersey, and so we see certainly a lot of influence in the rules and law in New Jersey and how that's made its way into what we're attempting to do here in Minnesota. So, um, we whether or not it's like a one-to-one match, there's a lot of times something out there that somebody has made that's similar enough. Somebody has made a wheel somewhere. I don't need to invent a brand new wheel. I can go out and look at what other people have done, what other groups have done, and just figure out how do we need to tweak this a little bit, make some edits to make this fit for what we experience here in Minnesota. So there's certainly a ton of similarities between the New Jersey rule, the New Jersey law, and what was put into the statutory language authorizing this rule. And so I think over these last 2.5 years, we've spent a ton of time trying to do that comparison and talk to people in those states or other locations that are doing similar work, and kind of really hoping to gain a lot of knowledge in talking to them about their experience. So New Jersey, for example, they're about 2.5 years ahead of where Minnesota is. They started implementing their version of um, this cumulative impacts analysis program about the same time we started just creating, or we started the rulemaking for ours. um, so, I have had a number of conversations with folks from New Jersey asking them, why did you do it this way? Was there something that you were thinking about? Because, I mean, it looks like you made a choice here, and I'm just trying to understand why or how that choice was made. Where are the bumps? They're now implementing their rules. They have facilities, they have businesses going through the rules, so we can see how people are um, responding to that and preparing the materials that go into the New Jersey law, the New Jersey documents and analysis, and figure out what, are there things we can learn from what they're experiencing there. So, big takeaway here is it's always easier to edit than create. So when we can, and that's a pretty common thing across not just this rule, but any rulemaking is, what examples do we have elsewhere? How could XYZ be done? um, how is that done elsewhere, and how could we do that here in the way that is we need to do. So
Great. Now I'd like to spend a couple questions, or some of our last few questions as we're approaching the end of our conversation, and zoom out a little bit. We've talked about, obviously, that this bill started bigger. There's a lot of things we could cover, and the current rule is focused. But I want to hear, Sasha, first from you on this point. What other environmental pressures do you hear about from frontline communities? What else in those conversations is coming up that you think needs to be addressed to ensure this cleaner environment, this cleaner future we're talking about for all Minnesotans? What are the other things that are coming up in your?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always feel like it is important when talking about cumulative impacts to not just focus on the environmental impacts, because it really does connect to a lot of different things. And so I do want to take a minute to talk about that, and then also talk about some of the other environmental impacts. I think it is easy to put that focus on just the environmental impacts, because there is still a cumulative impact of like having air pollution and water pollution and soil pollution and things like that, that we should definitely be taking into consideration. But I think there is also a very real social and economic factor that is really important to take into consideration when talking about these issues. I think an example that helps to hopefully helps people like kind of visualize what I'm talking about, is a lot of toxins and a lot of pollutants that we talk about end up having some level of impact on people developmentally. And so people living near highways or people that live near factories as they grow up, might have more issues developing like mentally, and then they might struggle in school. And then because of the neighborhood that they're in, they might not have many resources that help them get help for that. They might not have access to healthcare that is able to, address some of the symptoms that they're dealing with, or they may have to spend a lot of time in the hospital with like asthma attacks. And so they're missing more school, and then they don't have the economic opportunity that other people have. And you can just kind of see the way that it compounds and, creates these cumulative impacts that we're talking about in ways that, can really kind of perpetuate a lot of the issues that we're talking about. It makes it so much more difficult to remove yourself from this kind of situation when it's the entire system around you that is making it difficult. And so yeah, I think it's important that we really think about that social and economic context when talking about these issues. But in terms of the environmental impacts, I mean, we have seen some really good progress on lead, for example. That's an issue that I used to work on as well. I know Conservation Minnesota was also very involved in like the lead service line removal efforts through the legislature, also back in 2023. But that's definitely an issue that comes up, especially in like neighborhoods that have a lot of older homes that don't have the finances to get rid of the lead service lines themselves, and it just means that they're usually drinking lead contaminated water, and then again that just compounds on top of air pollution, living near highways, things like that. Another really important aspect is kind of rethinking like a lot of our overall like planning around both cities and outside of cities. Like I'm a big fan of public transportation, for example, and that's a big thing where like a lot of air pollution comes from using a lot of cars, and it's not even just the exhaust from gas-powered vehicles, but there's a lot of particulate matter just from tires. And so we can go electric with our vehicles, and we still should, but if you still have the same number of cars on the road, that's still going to be creating a lot of air pollution for those who live nearby. And so being able to find other ways to address some of these issues so that people are not exposed to the pollution from cars is a good example of how we can start to address some of these broader pollution issues. One of the interesting dynamics that we experienced when working on passing the bill back in 2023 was just that there is very different context between different communities, like a lot of the between different communities in the Twin Cities or in more urban areas versus rural communities. And so like in the Twin Cities, for example, it is more of that air pollution. But if you're looking at certain areas in greater Minnesota, a lot of them are more concerned about water pollution and like well contamination and runoff from agricultural activities and things like that. And so it's important to be able to look at those kinds of issues as well. And like the representative said, like how can we apply a cumulative impacts lens to all of these different issues in ways that help us understand the impacts and help us address them in ways that create a more equal burden and hopefully to help to reduce the overall impact of pollution in the long run.
Thank you, Sasha, for all that that detail. And I want to, before it's tough, you've set me up with a good segue, but I also don't want to move past the point you made at the beginning of that. I appreciate you bringing that, not necessarily the pure environmental angle, like talking about those other social and economic aspects. Obviously, we at Conservation Minnesota, we tend to be focused more on thinking in the environmental lens, but I think it's really important to see those connections, to name those connections, and be able to string that thread. So I just want to say, really appreciate you bringing that perspective into this conversation, and for all of everything that you just had to share. I think that's really valuable. And now I can do my segue. Now we can talk about move into the next question for Representative Agbaje. We've kind of talked about how this bill started so much bigger and it's focused, and now we've also talked about these different areas that we could apply this, and you named that goal of being able to apply this lens to all sorts of projects, all sorts of things we do. Are there any other specific areas right now where cumulative impact analysis are coming up, or the conversation is there? I mean, obviously we've talked about it's in a lot of things, but at the legislative level, I believe this past year, there was a bill specifically naming transportation as a sector to apply this lens to. Is that conversation moving? Are there other conversations with bills like that that are moving? Is that sort of, is the ball rolling like you had talked about, where we're taking that lens more and more into things in that legislative level?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, with a lot of us there, we always try to bring the conversation on any issue back to who is this benefiting, who is this burdening, and how can we spread that out. I think a couple of areas folks are interested in, like you mentioned, the bill on highways, to making sure that they do a cumulative impact study, or not study, but just to make sure that they get that information from the community, particularly for highways. I think we'll see that probably too. We asked for it during the conversation this past year about, or last year about pipelines and where they would be placed, particularly for transmissions lines. Because at the same time that we also want to electrify, we also want to make sure we're not putting those transmissions lines again in communities that have been overburdened. So that was something we asked about. I don't think we were able to fully get there. We got a little bit of some environmental impacts that had to be done before transmissions line could go in, but not the full cumulative impact assessment. We also want to make sure that really any development, particularly with the conversation around data centers, that would be a really good place to put that cumulative impacts lens on, and making sure that the community has a real say. I mean, I think the main goal for a law like this is that communities that have been overlooked, particularly communities of color, particularly Indigenous communities, that don't usually get a chance to influence or have a say in what's happening in their community, that they actually have a real valid way to bring that to the conversation. And so that way our regulators, our developers, they're not the only ones in the room having that conversation, but community has a real foothold and a real voice there. And like we were saying, like, at the end of the day, the decision to give a permit is still with the MPCA, but we're hopeful that something like this will make people pause to be like, well, maybe we actually shouldn't put a permit there, and maybe we can actually ask this developer or this industry to think about citing whatever they want to do somewhere else, or actually maybe they just do it differently. So that way there isn't that negative externality. And so I think that that is kind of the goal of this, and kind of what we're looking at as people keep coming to Minnesota saying they want to build this, they want to build that. And like we were talking about before, you can apply it to anything. And so I think you'll start to see these conversations also happening when it comes to housing, when it comes to schools and healthcare, all those types of things, making sure that we're building in a way that benefits everyone, and that we're not just kind of dumping everything on communities that really just have always been dumped on in the past.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Representative, and plenty of work ahead, but all good work. And we hope to stand by and help you out as best as we can on all of that. I want to give one more question I have prepared for Sasha, and then I'll move into some questions from the chat from our audience. Sasha, what can folks do to keep up? How can they keep up and stay involved with your work leading the coalition on cumulative impacts? What are the next steps you're seeing? How can folks help participate in that, or help ensure that the intended goal in this process is where we end up? How can folks help out?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hassan already did a great job of kind of laying out like where we are and what's coming up. And we're definitely getting to that point where like I know there's going to have to be like a long like internal review process for the draft rules, and not as many opportunities for like further engagement, because I know they have to meet that deadline. I want them to meet that deadline so that these rules go into effect. So I would say from my end, like our coalition is still hoping to, keep people engaged in this process. I think right now we're considering doing like a webinar or two kind of in the spring leading up to the rules to make sure that people are aware of like what's the process looking like, and how can people best, engage with the official comment period. And then I think once the comment period comes, which we're really hoping from the advocate side that it's at least a 60-day comment period so that people have that time to engage. We're hoping to do some like comment writing workshops so that people can, hear from people who have been involved in these kinds of things for a long time, of like what makes an effective comment, and like really also making sure that people understand that like you don't have to be a subject matter expert to provide good comments. Like we need to make sure that everyday Minnesotans are voicing their concerns around pollution or are sharing their thoughts on this rule. And that you don't need to, be able to provide like a technical analysis of cumulative impacts or air pollution for your voice to matter in this. And then once the rules are in place, we're hoping to do a lot of outreach to community groups and different communities that could be impacted by the rules, especially if there are maybe developments that are being proposed in certain communities that like maybe the EJ tool shows as being overburdened, or existing facilities that might have a permit up for renewal within the next couple of years that a community could look to get engaged in that kind of process. So yeah, we definitely want to make sure that Conservation Minnesota and other allies are, hearing about these opportunities and sharing them as well. And we do have a website. It's kind of out of date, but fcpc.org or fcpcmn.org is a website that has some more information on the coalition, as well as ways to sign up for email updates from us.
Great, thank you. We'll make sure to get as much information out to folks who are here and folks who registered and are watching this in not real time. We'll try and get all that information to folks. I have one question, and I only have time for one question from the audience, so we'll try to do this as quickly as you can. I have a question from Will, who asks, where do you all see the most urgent opportunities for improvement once the new rules are fully implemented? Where are the biggest potential payoffs? And we've kind of covered that, but I think in a few words, if we can, I'd love to hear from each of you. Like, where do you see the most urgent and the potential biggest opportunity coming out of all of this?
I'll sort of building on what Sasha just mentioned, some of the things like he mentioned about helping folks figure out or how to help write a good comment, right? We've heard this from Sasha and others throughout the rulemaking of sometimes it's just helpful to have educational materials to help people understand what this looks like, how to participate, sort of all of this, the kind of the who, what, when, where, and why kind of stuff, right? And we hear that not only from community, but from businesses and other and the folks that are going to be subject to this rule, advocacy groups for environmental, community, or business purposes. I think some of the we'll have the rules at some point, but what's going to be really helpful is how can folks participate in those rules. So how do we put materials out there like guidance or other things that are just helpful to anybody? So if I'm a community member, what should I know? How do I be involved? How do I, what can I do to influence the process? If I'm a business, what is MPCA looking for in this analysis? How can I do this well to address, what we are looking for in the analysis and in the rules? And again, kind of just really helping better describe how it all works, because this is going to be new, and new things are often scary to lots of people, but we can figure out ways to make it not so scary by having some helpful stuff out there for people to look at.
Yeah, I can respond quickly as well. Yeah, I think building off of one of the things Hassan said in terms of like people engaging in the process, one of the I guess more vague parts of the rules is kind of around like, well, at least what we've been hearing from MPCA is around like incorporating that lived experience. And like to me, that's a really important part that is also really difficult to like make too firm within like rules like this. And so I think figuring out over time as it's being implemented, like how do we make it so that people can, share their lived experience in EJ communities and, talk about what they experience with the pollution and, have that be incorporated into the analysis itself and hopefully into the decision making around the analysis is going to take time to get right, but I think is something that has a lot of potential. And I think the other area of high payoff is that community benefit agreement section where, there hopefully are going to be communities where, or like situations where a facility owner and a community can come together, can negotiate, can find a common ground where they decide that maybe there's some reduction in pollution and some benefits that will contribute to whatever the community wants, and that can help to create more unity between facility owners and communities. I don't anticipate every agreement to be like that. Some might be a bit more contentious, but I do hope that it's an opportunity for facilities to try and earn the trust of the communities that they're in, and to really try to provide benefits that at least help to reduce some of the overall impact and help to address some of the concerns that are in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, I hope that this process and, as the final rules get developed and as they get implemented, that it starts to build trust again between the community and the government. I think that's one of the biggest areas when it comes to these types of projects is just, a lot of people feel that they get steamrolled. And so I hope that this creates a better opportunity and a way forward that really takes into consideration community members, business developers, and the government into how things should move forward.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we are just past 7:30, so I don't want to take up too much more time from folks. But thanks to everyone in the audience who's been here for this conversation. Thanks, of course, to our panelists for their expertise and knowledge. Greatly appreciate you all taking the time to be here this evening.
All right, thanks, Al. Just going to do a quick closeout here. Thank you all for joining us. A big thank you again to our speakers for sharing your time and expertise tonight. Everyone deserves to be able to breathe clean air, and Conservation Minnesota will continue to advocate for solutions that ensure a clean air future. You can learn more about our work by visiting conservationminnesota.org. And if you'd like to watch previous Tell Me More online events, you can visit our Conservation Minnesota YouTube channel. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of the night.